Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. Every month, we invite an expert to enlighten us on a topic related to our mission. Because Village TV videotapes these presentations, we can share that expertise with a larger audience. We hope you enjoy today's broadcast.
Dr. Tad Daley.
Yes.
He has many college degrees. He has a PhD in policy analysis from the Rand School of Public Policy, where he was one of my favorite and best performing students. He currently serves as president of the Americans for Democratic Action Foundation of Southern California, a progressive political advocacy organization founded in 1947 by Hubert Humphrey, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., John Kenneth Galbraith, Walter Reuther, Reinhold Niebuhr, and Eleanor Roosevelt. He is currently working on a project with a group of international affairs scholars and practitioners, including former foreign ministers, heads of state, and a Nobel Prize laureate, to draft a second United Nations charter. He is the author of a book entitled Apocalypse Never, Forging the Path to a Nuclear-Free World, and has published more than 200 articles in various newspapers and magazines. He is now working on book number 2, on which today's talk is based. It considers the kind of United Nations we might invent if we were designing it from scratch today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my ex-student, Dr. Tad Daley.
Hello, everyone. Let me know if I mess up with the microphone. Happy to be with the concerned citizens of Laguna Woods on election night. And Professor Warren Walker and President Suzanne Modell, thank you. Thank you very much. I have given a lot of talks, but when invited by a former professor, you know, you feel like, at least in one person's eyes, you turned out all right. So this talk really does mean a lot to me. And I want to tell you that Warren Walker did 2 great things in my life, and I'd like to tell you about them in reverse order. A few years after I finished my PhD, my favorite wife, the public radio journalist Kitty Feldy, went to The Hague to cover the Yugoslavian war crimes trials. She had worked for KCRW and covered every single day of the O.J. Simpson trial. And she decided after that she wanted to generate some media coverage for trials that weren't just a media spectacle, but of true historical consequence. And it turned out that my former professor, Warren Walker, at that time was in the Netherlands, in The Hague, opening a brand new office for the Rand Corporation. So he took Kitty under his wing, he helped her figure out the public trans, fed her Sunday dinners. I think you made her join the book club, Warren.
Book club, yes.
That's right, and just really became a friend to her in a city where she had none. So thank you again. And we were kind of newlyweds there then, 2 or 3 years into our marriage. So that just is a memory that Kitty and I will both treasure. The other was a few years before that, as I was finishing up my PhD program. And Warren was a great mentor to me at a critical time because right in the middle of that program, the Cold War ended. I was a fellow in something called the Rand UCLA Center for Soviet Studies. And all of a sudden, one day, there was no more Soviet. It just went away. And Professor Warren Walker and others at Rand really helped me and others discern a pathway forward, being in the middle of training as a Sovietologist, being told a few years earlier when I entered the program there was a shortage of Sovietologists. And for me, that led to kind of 2 things that I've sort of pursued as a policy specialty in my career. One is nuclear weapons. The great legacy of the Cold War still persists today, and Warren mentioned my book on the topic of abolishing nuclear weapons before they abolish us, called Apocalypse Never. And the other was the United Nations. I was finishing my PhD in 1995, and that was the 50th anniversary year of the United Nations. And voices in that year, now here we are 30 years later, started to say, it's time to reinvent the United Nations. And so that's what I set out to do. A week after I finished my PhD in the summer of 1995, I co-founded an initiative called the Campaign for a New United Nations Charter. Did we get that new UN Charter in 1995? We did not. Do I think we still need one in 2025, a long 30 years later? That's what I'm here to talk with you all about tonight. So I want to start my tale tonight in April of 1945. A number of grand historical projects were simultaneously underway in that month. In Europe, the walls were closing in on Germany. The armed forces of Canada and Britain and the United States from the west, the mighty and battle-hardened Red Army from the east, poised to drive the final nail into the coffin of the odious Nazi regime. And they succeeded on May 8th. In Asia, a similar effort was underway to force Imperial Japan to accept an unconditional surrender. They succeeded on August 15th. In the deserts of New Mexico, thousands of scientists were laboring to invent a bomb that could destroy a city in a second, that would give humanity the ability to bring about its own extinction by its own hands. They succeeded on July 16th. And at that same time, April of 1945, hundreds of individuals were preparing to convene just north of here, in San Francisco, California, to invent a new global political body that might, as the eventual United Nations Charter they produced boldly proclaimed, quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. They succeeded, at least with that new international organization part, by signing that charter on June 26th and bringing the new United Nations into being on October 24th, 80 years ago, just last month. All these things were happening simultaneously in April of 1945, but then on April 12th, the President of the United States died. So the San Francisco conference opened as scheduled on April 25th, but just 4 days into their project, the framers made a trek across the Golden Gate Bridge to spend some time in quiet and contemplation among some of the oldest living things on Earth. The audio okay? The volume good? Everybody hearing me? Good. And they set into the ground a heavy metal plaque which contained these words, quote, here in this grove of enduring redwoods, preserved for posterity, members of the United Nations Conference on International Organizations met on April 29th, 1945, to honor the memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 32nd President of the United States, Chief Architect of the United Nations, and Apostle of lasting peace for all mankind. Isn't that a beautiful words? Go see it sometime and shout out to whoever it was who wrote those magnificent words of tribute for that historical giant. So now 80 years have come and gone, and the scourge that Apostle chose to confront is as acute today as it was 8 days ago. And a whole host of new challenges have emerged, ones not on anyone's radar screen in 1945. So as abundant as our admiration for FDR and his fellow architects might be, the time has come to take a look at that architecture for the challenges facing humanity in 2025 and beyond. As we will see, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the United Nations is long overdue for renewal, for renovation, and for reimagination. But there's a problem, a big problem. What in the world can we do about Article 109, Clause 2? I bet hardly anyone in this room, with the possible exception of the president of the UNA, has heard of that, but I'm going to tell you all about it tonight. It's the provision that decrees that anything that might come out of a conference to review that charter must be approved by all 5 of the Security Council's permanent members: France, Russia, China, the UK, and the US. Now, these 5 states, and I bet most of you do know this, were already given the ability, in Article 27, Clause 3, to command the whole rest of humanity into inaction and impotence. This is, quote, the veto, again, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. It's the greatest flaw in the San Francisco Charter. It exempts those 5 members from the equal application of the world rule of law to themselves. It degrades the democratic legitimacy of the entire edifice. And even when not actually cast, the veto dominates virtually every decision the Security Council makes, because it's always necessary to get all 5 on board. It's what the renowned late political scientist Walter Dean Burnham called, quote, the politics of excluded alternatives. It's a phrase I really like. And then when we turn our view from Article 27 to Article 109, we learn that these 5 states can also veto any kind of modification of their unique perch overlooking all of humanity. I've been following this stuff for a long time, and a while back The Economist magazine tossed a real cold bucket of water upon any prospect of UN transformation when it announced that, quote, the vetoers would veto a veto of the veto. Right? I wish I'd written that line myself. We can't take it away from them without getting permission from them. Is there any way out of this cul-de-sac of realpolitik? That's what I'm going to hope we can try to explore tonight. So let's take a look, please, beyond the veto, just that one giant flaw, and examine some other unsuitabilities of the UN's design of yesterday for the big questions of today. Point: the absence of any reference to climate or environment in the UN Charter, and the absence of actual success by the UN or anyone else in surmounting our looming climate catastrophes. Think about that. Not a word about climate, not a word about the environment. 80 years on, those are pretty big issues. Point: lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, which must now be incorporated into global public policy preparation for the next one, which is sure to come. Not at all on the radar screen in 1945. Point: a funding system both inadequate and unreliable, dependent exclusively on voluntary national contributions. Sometimes they arrive, sometimes they don't, but regardless, they give all the major donors the continual ability to bully the recipient. Point: pervasive gender inequality and oppression in so many areas of the world. A country like Afghanistan, close to my heart, Warren, because that's what my PhD dissertation was on at Rand, was on Afghanistan. And today, the government of Afghanistan openly deprives half its population of all of their human rights, and the entire outside world is wholly impotent to do anything about it. Point: a UN General Assembly with, the way I like to look at it, is 3 fundamental flaws. First, its basic operating principle, where India's 1.4 billion and Vanuatu's 330,000 exercise the same one nation, one vote, could hardly be more undemocratic or absurd. Second, it holds no power whatsoever to enact, let alone to enforce, something like binding international law. And finally, The UN General Assembly provides no voice at all for anyone beyond ambassadors appointed by the executive branches of national governments. Leaves out parliamentarians, leaves out marginalized groups, leaves out all figures in the opposition party, and everyone who voted for them. This is something that just kind of dawned. I'm not the only one who's examined this, but when it dawned on me, let me dive a little deeper into this. I'm sure there are many Republicans and Democrats in this room. Great, we live in a democracy. But right now, all you Democrats have zero voice in what happens in our global political body, right? Because the representative, Mike Waltz is his name, was appointed by Donald Trump. And just a year ago today, all you Republicans had zero voice in what happens in our global body because it was Linda Thomas Greenfield appointed by President Biden. So you see the problem? That's a problem of representation. And final point, as I go down my laundry list here, this is the last on this list. If the looming great power competition between China and the United States emerges as the centerpiece of world affairs in the second quarter of the 21st century, a new and even more dangerous Cold War, one can confidently predict that the UN will most likely again be relegated entirely to the sidelines, just completely irrelevant to the bilateral great power competition, which is coming to dominate the world. So, I think a meaningful package of creative amendments to the UN Charter beckons to us as both a practical necessity and a moral imperative. Because many of these problems of the modern age, climate paramount but hardly alone among them, are coming at us like a runaway freight train, breaks out, heading downhill. And in the immortal words of Neil Young, our Cadillac has got a wheel in the ditch and a wheel on the track. So, fortunately, there may be some good news because there are a number of civil society initiatives which have emerged quite recently aimed at inventing new tools of global governance that might help to slow down these multiple locomotives of a future catastrophe. And I really want to tell you about some of these. Get out your pen and paper if you want to write some of these down. One is, quote, the Coalition for the UN We Need, launched just 5 years ago during the UN's 75th anniversary year in 2020. Its forthright name immediately conveys its central conviction that the UN we got ain't what we need. And its coalition consists at this writing of 382 organizations focusing on a wide variety of different issue areas from dozens of countries around the world. So that's one. I was just on a Zoom this morning with the new executive director there. Another is the quote, Article 109 for a renewed UN Charter Coalition. That's the name of the campaign. It was launched in May of 2024 in Nairobi, just 18 months ago. And perhaps the most important name in its name is a renewed charter. See, this coalition does not advocate some specific renewed charter complete in every detail. It focuses instead upon the proposition that peace and justice and sustainability and planetary protection and widespread improvements in the human condition can be pursued through this vehicle of charter reform. And they hammer away at the point that this isn't their idea, but that the charter itself provides its own mechanism for review in Article 109. This new campaign, again, just May 2024, has been endorsed by hundreds of prominent global affairs thinkers and practitioners, more than 40 civil society organizations, and dozens of former diplomats, foreign ministers, heads of state, and Nobel laureates. So there's a lot of big shots saying this is the kind of thing we have to talk about. And the final example I want to give is 2023, what's that, 2 years ago, saw the launch of a project to frame, quote, a second United Nations Charter. This one, too, includes a somewhat different group of fancy dignitaries, and this is the one, as Professor Warren Walker mentioned, that has invited me to participate. Now, this project does present a specific and comprehensive package of amendments, performing literally a line-by-line revision of the present charter from beginning to end. But that's certainly not meant as a final product that any of us expect will be adopted someday in every detail. It's intended instead to generate discussion and debate and to demonstrate that the 1945 UN Charter is not the only possible kind. And some of this project's proposals, drawing on long-standing intellectual work in this arena, a little bit by me, but a lot by a lot of others, are, I think, quite ingenious. Let me tell you about some of them. One is, quote, an Earth Systems Council, with the mandate to address not war and peace, like the Security Council, but instead the health of our imperiled planetary biosphere. An official council at the UN to do that. That's an idea. Another is, quote, a parliamentary assembly, to correct some of those flaws that I tried to illuminate in the General Assembly, to provide voices not just for executive branches, but for elected national legislators, crucially including opposition parties, now would have a voice of some kind at the world level, and perhaps even, think about this, encouraging the emergence of transnational political parties, a formal forum where people in Germany and Brazil and Nigeria and the United States who think alike about the world can actually collaborate on projects to serve the world. And another, again, these are ideas that are in this Second United Nations Charter, is, quote, a standing UN peace force to address situations like Bosnia and Rwanda yesterday, Sudan and Haiti today, and who knows where tomorrow. Situations where no states appear willing to put their own forces at risk for conflicts that have nothing to do with them. And eventually to serve as a mechanism for the enforcement of world law. A couple more things about this Second United Nations Charter. The framers replaced the opening line of the present charter, which is "We, the peoples of the United Nations." I bet everybody has heard that at some point. We replaced that with this formulation: "We, the people of the world." See how that's slightly different, and we hope it will cultivate an ethic of human unity, planetary patriotism. And finally, this project seeks to strike just the right balance between optimal outcomes and contemporary political reality. I myself like to call this the global Goldilocks zone. A reimagined international organization not too hot and thus politically unlikely to be realized, not too cold and thus substantively unlikely to make much of a difference in surmounting big problems, but perhaps just right. That's the aspiration of the Second United Nations Charter project. Now, I want to talk about one more initiative that ain't in that Goldilocks zone, that openly advocates an ultimate aspiration. And part of the reason I want to share this is I want to share that I've had a few other mentors besides Professor Warren Walker. So there's a pair of twin organizations out there. One is called Citizens for Global Solutions here in the United States, and it's called the World Federalist Movement around the world. CGS is the American affiliate of this group called the World Federalist Movement. They promote the idea that just as we have an executive and a judiciary and a legislature in most of the cities and regions and nations of the world, even if they're somewhat fake in authoritarian countries, so too might we aim for that same basic framework to govern our one world. That's a big idea about the human future. They promote the idea that China and America can engage with each other tomorrow in the same way as the blue state of Illinois and the red state of Indiana do today. I grew up in Illinois, and the kid who grew up right next door to me, Carol, is sitting right over there, and that's why I chose the blue state of Illinois and the red state of Indiana. They have different laws, they have different political ideologies, but they don't have armies, they don't have arms races, and they don't have wars. And the vision is that someday the nations of the world can exist together in that same kind of framework. They promote the idea that there can be a next step in the social evolution of humankind, something which some call a federal republic of the world. I told you, this wasn't in the Goldilocks zone. This is an ultimate aspiration. And these outfits were launched not recently, but in 1947. Now I'm going to tell you about a couple of my mentors. The founder of the student division of the U.S. organization in 1947, a charismatic teenage boy named Harris Wofford. He went on to become a key aide to President Kennedy. He went on to become a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, and he went on to become a great friend and mentor to me. Their president at this time, a bright young man named Alan Cranston. I bet there's a few people in this room who remember Alan Cranston. He went on to become a U.S. Senator from California for nearly a quarter century and a great boss and mentor to me. And the chair of their board, a fellow named Albert Einstein. Some pretty big thinking people have put forth some pretty large imagination, large visions of their imagination of the human future. And both of these outfits are still in business today, Citizens for Global Solution and the World Federalist Movement. And just to let you know, they weren't the only ones talking about this kind of grand vision in I was about to say 1947, but what I really mean is in the 5 or 6 years right after the United Nations was born. Wait till you hear this. Probably the single most prominent proponent of this idea of transforming the United Nations into something that can bring about enduring world peace was President Harry S. Truman. You ready for this? Please listen closely. When the UN Charter was 2 minutes old, right after he signed it, he said this, quote, "This charter, like our own Constitution, will be expanded and improved as time goes on. No one claims that it is now a final or perfect instrument. Changing world conditions will require readjustments to find a way to end wars." I'm talking about this stuff 80 years later. Harry Truman said it 2 minutes after signing the charter. And then, this gets even better. In a speech in Kansas City, when the UN Charter was 2 days old, he took a train. He took a train all the way from San Francisco to Kansas City, his home state, and there he said this, quote, "Now, if Kansas and Colorado have a quarrel over a watershed, they don't call out the National Guard and go to war over it. They bring suit in the Supreme Court and abide by its decision. There isn't a reason in the world why we can't do that internationally. It will be just as easy for nations to get along in a republic of the world as it is for us to get along in the Republic of the United States." So I'm offering you some large visions here, from some pretty significant historical figures. Now, this last vision of the human future, articulated by Daley and Wofford and Cranston and Truman and a few others, is almost certainly one that won't be realized anytime soon. But we need to recognize that if separate sovereign states must compete with each other in perpetual arms races, in new weapons technologies, forever until the end of time, that more than anything else surely will spell our doom. But there is, I'm sort of coming back to the Goldilocks zone, kind of coming back to the real world. Because among those of us in this arena, I told you I was just on a Zoom this morning with the head of that one first outfit, the Coalition for the UN We Need. many of us often have just kind of an air of weary resignation, including me. We say, quote, well, a new and improved United Nations could tackle so many of humanity's problems. But alas, we need to lower our sights. We'll never get anything like that because the permanent five will forever block that. That's what I opened with, this Article 109, Clause 2. And my thesis that I am trying out on you all for the first time tonight is that maybe they won't. Maybe there are some scenarios where Article 109, Clause 2 does not permanently prevent us from ever moving forward on these kinds of fronts. Point: it's not impossible to imagine that cold calculations of national self-interest might lead to P5, that's what they're called, the P5. P5 calculations beyond eternal opposition to change. Let me give you 3 reasons. First, sure, the U.S. government might benefit from its ability, just choosing them as an example, us as an example, the U.S. government might benefit from the ability to block UN activities it does not desire, but it also suffers from Moscow and Beijing's equal ability to put a stop to Washington's pursuit of its own objectives at the UN. Ukraine, right? I mean, President Biden very much wanted to do some stuff about Ukraine at the United Nations, but Russia had the veto, so the UN was irrelevant. The benefits of the power to wield the veto against others' initiatives must be balanced against the costs of one's own initiatives being vetoable by the other 4. Second, again, I'm trying to drill down on national interest here. Let's consider Washington perhaps at its apogee of political and economic power. Is it inevitable that the U.S. government will throw molasses in the works at every turn? An administration in Washington, whether Republican or Democratic, just might conclude that the single most influential UN member state should shape and lead rather than just resist and hinder an emerging UN Charter review process. Better perhaps to seize that leadership role today rather than letting China do it tomorrow. And finally, again from the perspective of cold calculations of national interest, surely someone inside the councils of the governments of the P5 will someday make the case that the veto isn't actually going to serve anyone's national interest if the planet is on fire, if World War III is over the horizon, if the AI robots are coming for us all. Right? And even if we just get implacable P5 opposition to change, I think we can steadily ramp up the pressure upon them. So when I talk to my buddies in the bar, most of them vaguely know that 5 countries can block the UN from doing pretty much anything, the veto. But none, I repeat, none of them know those same 5 can also block the UN from ever changing anything about the UN. More than once, Warren Walker, I've talked to global affairs professionals at RAND and other places who don't know that either. Simply engaging in public education about the monstrous unfairness of Article 109, Clause 2, surely over time will turn up the heat on the P5. Especially because, and I haven't told you this yet, there's more to Article 109 than just Clause 2. The first clause of Article 109 reads, quote, "A general conference of the members of the United Nations for the purpose of reviewing the present charter may be held by a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly and any 9 members of the Security Council." Any. That word any opens a universe of possibility. The summoning of a UN Charter Review Conference is not, repeat not, subject to the veto. This is unlike almost everything of major consequence at the UN, where the P5 always seems to have sort of decisive power. Here is one thing of potentially infinite consequence for our future prospects where they don't. Even if all 5 states were opposed, an Article 109 conference still might be called to order. So my buddies in the bar and some of those global affairs professionals don't know that either. I bet a lot of you didn't know it because hardly anybody pays any attention to this. So just one of the reasons I said yes, Warren, and I wanted to come here, just as we should draw public attention to the iniquity. Sorry, I said iniquity. I meant inequity, but maybe both words apply, huh? The inequity of Clause 2, we should do the same regarding the potential of Clause 1. Because it is my thesis that the call to activate Article 109 can become a powerful mobilizing force. It can provide something tangible and specific to urge upon policymakers while leaving open what might ultimately emerge from the process. It can bring together a wide variety of activists working on many other issues who could pursue planetary governance upgrades to advance their own agendas. It can assemble a broad coalition of those who might hold many different future world visions, but who could all agree to pursue the process in the UN Charter itself to define the most appropriate vision for our unfolding 21st century. So it is my thesis, my speculation, not a certain future, but I think this is a possible future, that all these calculations regarding both Clause 2 and Clause 1 may eventually bring us to the stage where 9 of the 15 Security Council members and 129 of the 193 General Assembly members are ready to authorize that, quote, General Conference. As momentum grows from smaller states, from civil society pressure inside larger states, from a surging world public opinion, it just might mobilize a grand global movement that the P5 will in the end find impossible to resist. Especially because there may be another avenue of escape from our Article 109 Clause 2 dilemma altogether. And for this one, I draw upon history that everyone in this room knows very well. I want to talk, as I'm getting close to wrapping up here, about a pair of historical precedents that might just show us an alternative. First, as every one of us learned as American school children, when delegates, if you grew up in the United States, sorry, maybe some people here didn't, but as I learned, and I think most of us learned in school, in Arlington Heights, Illinois, with you, Carol, when delegates from the 13 newly independent American states met in Philadelphia in 1787, their official purpose was to amend the Articles of Confederation, right? And after they had invented a new kind of government, everyone assumed they would use the amendment process set out in those articles to bring their new nation into being. What was that process? It was unanimity. That was the amendment procedure in the Articles of Confederation. All 13 needed to agree on everything in order for anything to go forward. All 13 had a veto, right? That's the way to look at it. So the American framers chose a different path. Their new document made no reference to the Articles of Confederation, but instead it contained its own procedures for coming into force. When 9 of the 13 state legislatures voted to join the new federation, the United States Constitution would take effect. That happened on June 21st, 1788, when New Hampshire became the 9th state to do so, and the following spring, on March 4th, 1789, a new thing in history was born. The real birthday of this country. My second example is more recent. It's what I've been talking about all night. It's the invention of the United Nations. Because there was a predecessor to the United Nations, and again, I know everybody in this room knows this. It was called the League of Nations. So the framers in San Francisco might have set out to establish what they created via the amendment process set out in the League of Nations Covenant of 1920. It required the approval for amendments of a majority of its assembly and all 9 members of its council. But the UN Charter, exactly like the U.S. Constitution, ignored the League Covenant and contained its own procedures for coming into force. A majority of the San Francisco signatories and all the newly designated P5. And when that requirement was met on October 24th, 1945, a new thing in history was born. So let us imagine an Article 109 Charter Review Conference unfolding in much the same way as the 1787 Convention in Philadelphia or the 1945 Conference in San Francisco. Again, this isn't the only possible scenario, but I think it's certainly one scenario. The conference is convened, perhaps with the participation of all the P5 or perhaps with none. The conference produces a new document, perhaps with an elaborate package of amendments. That's the approach taken by our second charter project, or perhaps written out from scratch on a blank sheet of paper, which was the approach taken in both Philadelphia and San Francisco. But crucially, that new document makes no reference to Article 109, Clause 2, and instead contains its own rules for entry into force. What might happen after that? You know, it's anyone's guess. I guess it's possible that after all that, both convening both the big civil society campaign that I and others are trying to generate, leading to the convening of a conference, and the conference producing a result, that maybe still all 5 of the P5 will stand obstinately apart. But maybe, just maybe, as the far greater suitability of a new organization for our 21st century world becomes apparent, more and more states, including the P5, will conclude that coming aboard will serve both their individual national interests and the common human interest, will turn the tide for humanity from despair to hope, and will give Homo sapiens a fighting chance to save ourselves from ourselves. And then, just maybe, a new thing in history will be born. Just one more thing, Madam President, and then I am ready to wrap up. So my buddies in the bar, my last reference to them, they may not know much about Article 109, but they know the name of the President of the United States. And whenever I talk about any of this stuff with them, which ain't too often, but when I do, it doesn't take too long before one of them says, quote, "Trump's not going to go for that." But I want you to understand that this work is not about this political hour. These are probably not near-term objectives, but instead they offer a positive, I hope, a positive vision of what humanity might do to build the future we desire and deserve. Someday, perhaps, the prevailing political winds will all be blowing together in the right directions. We can't let ourselves be held back forever by the ball and chain of what I call the triple P, present political possibility. We need to openly proclaim a vision of the world we want to bequeath to future generations. So after you make your visit to that FDR plaque up north of the Bay Area in Muir Woods, among those ancient and towering redwoods, I want you to make your way back to Oakland. I want you to get yourself on an Amtrak, and don't get off until you arrive at Union Station in Washington, D.C. That's what Harry Truman did, so you can do it. Then take a stroll over to the tidal basin on the National Mall, and please step inside the Thomas Jefferson Memorial. And there you will find emblazoned upon the walls an abbreviated version of a letter he wrote to one Samuel Kercheval in 1816. That was only 27 years after the launch of the U.S. Constitution. But Thomas Jefferson's sentiment about that document at that time, quote, "Some look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. I am not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. we might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him as a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. So, my friends, thank you very much for having me tonight. Let us now weave a garment of our own, one suitable for weathering the storms, exploring the vistas, and reaching for the promise of the 21st century. Let us now act as chief architects of a redesigned and democratized and empowered United Nations. And let us now serve as apostles, apostles of lasting peace for all of humankind as we proceed on our endless journey from the caves to the stars. Thank you for having me tonight. Democracy is difficult, and getting human beings to agree on anything is difficult. Getting 193 states to agree on anything is difficult. But I certainly think we ought to try to put out some kind of a positive, hopeful future vision and see how many people and states we can get to agree. And I would like to say about the EU that I think it is a work in progress. And thank you for reminding me of the EU. It's something that I do talk about in talks I give from time to time, but I left it out tonight. But it is clearly the most advanced example in the world today. I mean, I thank you so much for pointing that out, of this kind of transnational governance, this kind of creation of transnational institutions. And yes, they've had some setbacks. Yes, the United Kingdom decided to leave. But one thing, as I paid close attention to this when that was going on, and one thing I noticed is that right after the United Kingdom left, they did surveys in like most of the, I think, is it 27? Is that how many countries? It's something like that, are in the EU, about whether, just public opinion surveys. You want Poland to leave? You want the Czech Republic to leave? You want Italy to leave? And it was like 10%. It's sort of the departure of the UK kind of reinforced for many Europeans their commitment to try to be Europeans. And I think the final thing I'll say in response to the very worthy challenge is much of this might take place more evolutionarily than revolutionarily. And probably the best example of that is the European Parliament. It started out exactly like the Parliamentary Assembly that you heard me describe in the Second United Nations Charter. This project, the Second United Nations Charter. There was a Parliamentary Assembly in the 50s as part of the, what was it called then? The EEC, right? It was called the EEC back in the 1950s. But it evolved eventually into what is today the European Parliament, which clearly has some flaws, but it's a transnational parliament. And when people in France go to the ballot box, let me just do this, forgive me. I'm going for a little bit more than 2 minutes on this one, Suzanne. When if we're all Americans in this room, when we go to the ballot box, we elect someone to represent us in our city council, in our state legislature, and in our national Congress. When someone in Italy goes to the ballot box, they elect someone to represent them in their city councils, in their regional legislatures, in the Italian legislature, and in something larger, the European Parliament. And it's my dream, and I'm not the only one who has had it. One person who talked about it is Alfred Lord Tennyson in 1837 when he wrote a poem about the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World, is that we ought to have some kind of democratic voice, not just at the local and state and national level, but also at the global level. So, thanks very much.
I was wondering if there's any discussion about moving the UN building out of the United States to a different country that's more central in the world. I'm considering the Middle East and possibly Jerusalem.
I have heard, I'm going to give a real honest answer. For those of you who don't know, just thank you. the history is, was it Rockefeller, Dave, who donated a bunch of money? Donated a bunch of money and had a bunch of land on the East River. And of course, in 1945, much of the developed world was destroyed. So they said, let's put it here in New York. I haven't really heard anything, ma'am, about being more central. And I may get in trouble for saying this, but what I have heard is, given the current administration in Washington and the fact that this seems to happen from time to time in Washington, and this kind of administration may come again, there are some, I've heard more than a few voices say, this is the wrong place for the United Nations. We need to put it in some kind of country that is clearly, firmly, and permanently committed to being part of the family of humankind. I have heard that on more than one occasion. Thanks for bringing it up. And not just about Trump, but about the perpetual fluctuations in American politics. Thanks, sir. I'm sorry to...
Thank you. I have this problem in asking questions like this. Whenever somebody very well-known and brilliant like yourself comes up with something that's really clear that I've also thought of, I can't compliment you without seeming to denigrate how obvious it was, or to boost my own brilliance by claiming that I thought of it. So I'll just plunge ahead and say that.
I'll happily confess to plagiarizing your work, sir.
No, I think it's sometimes...
Sorry, tell me your name.
I'm Jonathan.
Jonathan, yeah.
Somebody is monitoring my thoughts with little things in my teeth and things sometimes. Be that as it may. All right. So yes, it occurred to me that when there is an institution, a structure that's not working, that's, doing worse than not working, that's just doing nothing, the obvious solution is to, put it in a little box and say, go do your thing and create a new one. And yes, the League of Nations to the UN and the Articles of Confederation to the United States occurred to me. But it also occurs to me that we're right in the middle of one of those things right now in the United States, in our politics and our structure, where you have somebody who finds the Constitution very inconvenient, in fact, the whole rule of law inconvenient, and is creating a new structure. At the same time, what occurs to me is what Ben Franklin told the lady who asked him outside of the Constitutional Convention, what have you given us, Mr. Franklin, a monarchy or a republic? And his famous words, of course, were a republic if you can keep it.
Yeah.
So any structure that you're talking about that we can imagine is really going to depend upon people of good faith and principle and courage to operate the structure. The structure is not going to operate itself. So that's my comment, your reaction. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you for thinking of this stuff all before I did.
Oh, simultaneous.
Simultaneous works for me, yeah. Yeah. I'm hesitating because, we invented a constitution, just to talk about this country. I feel like it's dependent on more than just the goodwill of people, and just people acting in good faith. I think when one reads the Federalist Papers, and some of the people in my orbit from time to time say maybe it's time for some world Federalist Papers, thinking about that unification in the same way. Sorry for hesitating in answering, but, and it's not a definitive answer, Jonathan, by any means, but they almost said the opposite. They said, human beings are venal and self-interested and not always motivated by the highest and noblest motives. and we're going to try our best to create a governmental structure that can somehow, that was the idea of checks and balances, was if you just create an all-powerful executive branch, then they can kind of run away with things. So I think it is possible to at least try to create some governmental structures that are not just dependent on good people with good motivations being in charge. But yes, as you very articulately pointed out, we're in an experiment right now, right? I agree with you that today, November 4th, 2025, we have a republic if we can keep it. I hope that was a little, I don't feel like it was a very coherent answer, but I want us to take our best shot at creating some governmental structures that can survive even the present moment. Yes, ma'am, hi.
Hi.
Who are you?
I'm Laura.
Great glasses, Laura. I love the glasses. Aren't they cool? Turn around, show the crowd, would you? Look at Laura's glasses. Aren't they cool? Really?
My comment or question, well, first of all, I don't think human beings are venal or somehow depraved or deprived or
Okay,
any
good,
of that.
good.
I think that's imposed on
Madison did, but that doesn't mean we have to.
That's imposed on us by a religious structure, and it's not true. But that's not what I want to say. How does the United Nations interface with the international court system? And how does the rulings, or do you know, of the international court system, how can those rulings be imposed on whoever they're ruling on? How do we bring that justice into play, into reality?
All right, here we go. Yeah, no, thank you, Laura. I'm really having a good time here. And Suzanne, I can go as long as you wish, because this is I cannot mean this more genuinely. Every single question has been really solid and deep and substantive. Point one, I think it's part of the UN Charter. There's a separate thing called the Statute of the International Court of Justice. And I may have this history wrong, but I think it was ratified in the same way and at the same time. I think it came into effect also on October 24th, 1945. That's point one, but I may be mistaken about that. Point two, it's a court, but it's kind of not a court. Imagine if you and I had some commercial dispute or a car crash, and let's say I did something bad to you, and so you wanted to take it to court, and so you went to the court, and the court said, well, we got to ask his permission to accept the jurisdiction of the court. And I said, no, not this time. I mean, that's literally how the ICJ works. The ICJ, first of all, it applies, International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court. They're the same thing. There are sort of some exceptions to this, and there are some countries that have said we accept the compulsory jurisdiction, but it doesn't mean as much as it sounds like.